You're listening to the Diplomats Asia Geopolitics podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Katie Putz, recording from Maryland.
And this is Ankit Panda from Washington, D.C.
So, Ankit just returned from the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, which we're going to dive right into discussing who was there, what was said. But first, welcome back to Washington, Ankit. How is the jet lag treating you?
Thanks, Katie. As I'm sure none of our listeners will be surprised, I have gotten quite rusty at tolerating jet lag, and the trip to Singapore is actually pretty difficult from the East Coast. So I'm doing okay, hanging in there. But yeah, definitely doing this podcast probably a little bit more jet lag than I would like to be for. But anyways.
I think that's just going to enhance the conversation.
Well,
So, the Shangri-La dialogue is billed as Asia's preeminent security forum. It's usually held annually, but as you noted, it's been a while since you've gotten to do this. Hasn't been held since 2019 due to the pandemic. So that means there's plenty of accumulated issues and security issues in Asia to discuss. Going into the dialogue, I know many of us were watching with anticipation a pair of dueling speeches by top US and Chinese defense officials. The opening keynote was delivered by the Japanese Prime Minister, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also appeared in a video address. But I want to start, Ankit, with Japanese Prime Minister Kishida's keynote. What did he convey about his administration's view on security in the region and Japan's role in regional security? And did this provide sort of a framing for the rest of the dialogue?
Sure. Yeah. It was terrific to hear from Prime Minister Kishida. It was a terrific opportunity for him, given that Japan is undertaking a national security strategy review right now that's going to manifest in a new set of national defense program guidelines and, of course, the new NSS document itself. So he talked a bit about Japan's thinking about regional security issues. I mean, the theme of his speech was that I think the world is a lot more dangerous of a place today than it was in 2019 when the Shangri-La dialogue last convened, not just because of a global pandemic and rising geopolitical tensions, but of course the war in Ukraine and the violations of Ukraine's sovereignty by Russia. And so I think the banner idea that Kishida delivered during his keynote that sort of colored the rest of the dialogue, which is exactly the purpose of a keynote speech, was the notion that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. He specifically used that framing in his speech, and that I think was a topic of discussion on the sidelines, in some other speeches as well. We heard, of course, from many of the defense ministers around the region about how the conflict in Ukraine, which some defense ministers were frank that when the war started, it seemed very distant from Southeast Asia, but now with the follow-on effects on energy security, food security, and so forth, that this is a globalized conflict. We still live in a globalized world despite the deglobalization trend. And so that was significant. The other thing that really jumped out to me that I noted on Twitter during the keynote was Prime Minister Kishida's emphasis on nuclear issues, which is really, unusual. The Shangri-La dialogue is not where one goes to discuss nuclear issues traditionally. It's very focused on conventional military issues. But of course, the nuclear threat environment around Japan has gotten a lot more dire. Kishida actually, the first time he mentioned China by name in his speech, it was alongside the United States, and he called on the U.S. and China to engage in arms control, clearly expressing concern about China's nuclear buildup, which was something that we also came back to with the Chinese defense minister. So I thought all of that was interesting, and it was really, I think, a great keynote to kick off the 3 days of dialogue. And let me just say, Katie, I mean, I think the Shangri-La dialogue really demonstrated the value of the in-person format. I mean, there were tremendous numbers of bilateral meetings on the side. Obviously, great for non-governmental people like me to catch up with friends and colleagues from around the region and around the world. But really, I think after more than 2 years of Zoom, I think everybody was very glad to have a chance to engage in in-person discussions and dialogue.
Yeah, so actually, that's a great point to make. I want to turn to the U.S.-China relationship. The speeches by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Chinese Defense Minister Wang Feihe ostensibly set out, their competing visions for security in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, whichever nomenclature you prefer. I want to get, what are your impressions of those two speeches, and then, what is your impression of the meeting that they did hold on the sidelines of the dialogue? As you said, the Shangri-La dialogue is not just these panels and speeches, but an awful lot of minister to minister contact on the sidelines. It is a track one forum primarily. I'm curious what your impression of the U.S.-China relationship within the context of Shangri-La.
Yeah, I mean, so the sequencing of events goes, the bilateral happened first, and then, as is tradition, the Shangri-La dialogue lasts for 3 days. It opens on the Friday evening with the keynote, and then Saturday morning, the U.S. Defense Secretary always speaks, and then Sunday morning, the Chinese Defense Minister speaks, and so that's the sequencing. So the bilateral happened. It was reported on. There were readouts that went out, focused traditionally again from the United States on guardrails and risk reduction. The PRC side, of course, laid down the law on things like China's view of Taiwan and Taiwan Strait issues. We saw some interesting reporting from a few reporters that were there, including Peter Martin at Bloomberg, who reported on the fact that China has apparently conveyed to the United States that it doesn't consider the Taiwan Strait to be international waters anymore. And so I think we're slowly seeing, many of the tensions in around Taiwan continue to simmer up. The U.S. expressed concerns about Chinese activities in the region. Of course, we talked about the remarkably dangerous conduct by a Chinese J-16 pilot in vicinity of an Australian P-8A surveillance aircraft in the South China Sea, where the pilot released chaff that was apparently ingested by the engines of the P-8 that could have gone horribly wrong and resulted in probably the worst disaster in the airspace above the South China Sea since the 2001 Hainan incident between the U.S. and China. So the guardrails issue, I think, was pretty prominent. And then getting to the speeches, look, I mean, I think there were, I think there were a few surprises on both sides. The Shangri-La dialogue is an opportunity for both sides to lay out their visions for regional security. Secretary Austin's speech was long, it was detailed, it sort of talked about all of what the United States is doing in the Indo-Pacific, which is traditionally a focus of the Secretary of Defense's speech in the region. There was an emphasis, of course, on this idea that the U.S. is not asking countries in the region to choose, which I think is an important message for the U.S. to be delivering in Southeast Asia. Whether or not countries were convinced is another matter, but Secretary Austin certainly made that a component of his speech. Wei Fenghe's speech, I think, drew more headlines for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think every time the Chinese the Chinese defense minister goes to Shangri-La, he's speaking for two audiences. He's speaking, of course, for the global audience, the global media, the delegates at Shangri-La, and then for the internal audience in China. And so here, I think Wei Fenghe again focused quite a bit on Taiwan, on what China perceives as U.S. encroachment on its core interests. He directly threatened that China would be willing to fight a war to the end over the Taiwan issue, which he described as is China's longstanding policy as a strictly internal issue. And I think in terms of tone, it was a much darker tone. It was received as such, I think, in the region. And then the only other thing to add is that what was interesting to hear from some of the Southeast Asian delegates was the commonalities that they perceived between the U.S. and China. I mean, both sides tried to present themselves as benign, and I found that interesting because I think that's something that maybe some Americans still miss, which is that in Southeast Asia, particularly among the unaligned or the less aligned countries, there is still a perception that, or at least a desire for the U.S. and China to really just, quiet down and ignore this great power competition. But I think, unfortunately, like it or not, this is here to stay. I mean, this was a common theme between 2019 and 2022, the U.S. and China really using the dialogue to portray mutually incompatible visions in some ways for regional security.
So do you think, I just want to stick on this for one moment longer. I was talking to our editor-in-chief, Shannon Tiezi, earlier today about the speeches. And one of the things she pointed out to me is Wei's speech only mentioned the Global Security Initiative, which is something that President Xi Jinping had brought up earlier in the year and has popped up in a few things without really being fully defined as a security initiative. Wei didn't really talk about it. And so it was interesting that a speech that's sort of advertised as China's vision for security in the region kind of left out what looks like it might be a security initiative. Do you read that as significant, or it's just something that wasn't included, or is that because that smacks too much of like an effort to form a bloc when the message that China is trying to put forward is, we're also not trying to make everyone pick sides, but
Yeah.
also pick our side.
So the global security initiative thing is interesting. I'm not sure people really have a grasp on what it is. All we know is that Xi Jinping thinks it's important, and it's some kind of banner Chinese initiative for security announced at the Boao Forum for Asia. And Xi has sort of used the Boao Forum to deliver messages like this to the region in the past, including about the sort of docile intentions of the Belt and Road Initiative, and so on and so forth. So I think Wei Fenghe isn't probably the right conduit, and the Shangri-La dialogue probably isn't the right forum to offer more clarity on that.
Mm.
We heard, Wei repeated, comments like, China has never encroached another inch on another country's territory. And in the Q&A session, he got a question about, well, what about India in 2020? And a Vietnamese delegate asked him about, of course, the Sino-Vietnamese War, to which he had a very condescending answer that frankly did not make him look very good, in my opinion, even in the eyes of many of the Southeast Asians present. And so I think, there's still several questions about, what exactly China's vision for the region is. I mean, that was, I believe, the title of Wei's keynote was China's vision for regional order or something like that. And he didn't really, he explained in very clear terms what China was against. But I think when he was talking about what China was for in the region, it really came off as sort of platitudinal or rather non-specific. The other thing I want to point out while we're still talking about Wei Fenghe's speech was that there was a very interesting question asked by Alistair Gale at the Wall Street Journal, who was actually sitting next to me at the dialogue, about China's nuclear arsenal. And Wei Fenghe, of course, before he became defense minister, was the last head of the Second Artillery Corps, which is the part of the PLA that operates China's ground forces. After 2015, that became the PLA Rocket Force. And so Wei Fenghe knows a lot about these issues, and he actually sort of relished in this question and answered it in an interesting way. He did not deny the fact that China was modernizing and potentially even expanding its nuclear force, as the U.S. addressed. And so in the context of his statements about, fighting to the end over Taiwan, I think it raised concerns. Again, I think, nuclear weapons this year at Shangri-La were a much bigger theme than anybody had really anticipated, certainly than I had anticipated going in.
Yeah, well, good thing they invited you then, you know? So I think before we close out, I want to go back to Ukraine. If someone had suggested several years ago that the Ukrainian president would be addressing Shangri-La dialogue, I'd have been a little skeptical. But since the Russian invasion 4 months ago and the ongoing conflict, I think it's really dovetailed with existing, big picture security questions in Asia. Some of those were highlighted by the Japanese prime minister. So it wasn't a surprise to see him. I mean, after all, Zelensky's spoken at everything from the UN Security Council to the Grammys, so why not Shangri-La also? How was Zelensky's speech received in Singapore and by the Asian security community more broadly? Because I think you certainly see U.S. allies a bit more strong against Russia and about the importance of the Ukraine issue, and a lot of Southeast Asian countries a little bit more hesitant to be forward with the issue. It's much more distant for them, and is sort of a competing agenda item. So, how was that speech received, and what was your interpretation of what its implications were?
I think it was received very well. I mean, after Zelensky spoke, I think there was, 30 seconds of continuous applause in the room. The room was fully packed with delegates, so there was a degree of interest to hear what the Ukrainian president had to say. It was a live stream from Ukraine, and he actually engaged in a Q&A with the audience as well, which I was a little surprised by. I thought it might be a recording or that he might just
Mm-hmm.
speak and then depart. But no, he actually engaged with the dialogue as all defense ministers and even the prime minister of Japan did. And so, it was very good to see. His message, I think, was, predictable, which was, he of course criticized Russia's war and emphasized why the conflict in Ukraine should matter to the rest of the world, why it should matter to Asia, what Ukraine needs from the rest of the world, and the fact that, of course, the dialogue was taking place in Singapore made this a particularly poignant moment because Singapore, of course, sanctioned Russia quite early on, and the Singaporean government has a principled position on this, which is that for a small country like Singapore that very much depends on a rules-based international order to secure its interests, the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty is something that's just simply intolerable. And I think that was a view that was shared by many, Southeast Asian states States, even delegates from countries who haven't formally sanctioned Russia or continue to do business with Russia. And then this was the first Shangri-La dialogue where the Russians were explicitly disinvited, given the conflict in Ukraine. And so I think the response to the speech was good. I think in general, Ukraine pervaded many of the speeches at the dialogue. We also had participation from several European countries who have been increasingly visible at the Shangri-La dialogue, who made the point, and there was a whole panel on this, that European and Asian security cannot be thought of as two separate theaters anymore. That this is all really interlinked, and I think that plays into sort of broader concerns in the West about a broader alignment between Russia and China, so to speak, and how that might manifest both in Asia and in Europe. And so, that was sort of the biggest takeaway that I had from the Zelensky speech and the overall implication of the Ukraine conflict at the Shangri-La dialogue. The other thing that came up was, food insecurity and the very practical sort of second order effects of the conflict on Southeast Asia. And so that, I think was welcome to see, sort of this recognition from regional defense ministers that a war in Europe, while perhaps distant at first, very much has global consequences, and sort of what that means for how the region should be thinking about security.
I'm glad that you brought that panel up regarding sort of the intertwined nature of European security and Asian security. I think we like to sort of wall off the regions as if they don't interact, but they really do. And obviously, administrations around the world have to order their priorities, but these are all on the list. Is there anything else, from the dialogue that you think maybe didn't get as much attention as maybe it should have? Any topics that came up that struck you as worthy of greater focus?
Well, so let me talk actually a bit about an omission that I found interesting, which is North Korea. Right, I talked about nuclear issues coming up a lot at the dialogue, but I didn't mean North Korea, because North Korea was very much, I think, not an issue, and this is somewhat remarkable because it's the busiest year of missile testing in North Korean history is 2022, and North Korea was very prominent in 2017 and 2018 when sort of they were crossing major qualitative thresholds. It was really only Japanese Defense Minister Nobuo Kishi and South Korean Defense Minister Lee Jong-sup that focused on North Korea in any detail. The other ministers that mentioned North Korea, it was sort of, perfunctory, we want denuclearization, we're going to enforce sanctions, very kind of baseline. But I found that interesting. I think it sort of speaks to a level of Korea fatigue maybe setting in the region where the Korean Peninsula security situation really matters to South Korea and Japan, but it matters less to the other countries. Secretary Austin, in his speech, too, I think really just focused on North Korea for a paragraph or two. It was very much kind of predictable. There was no panel on North Korea this year or on the Korean Peninsula per se, which, of course, as somebody that focuses on Korea, I perhaps zeroed in on more than I should have, but it did really seem like a notable change. The other issues that I think, didn't really come up a lot, or at least, didn't really bubble to the top of the dialogue, are sort of direct Southeast Asian security issues. There was a lot of focus on Myanmar, which I think is unsurprising, since that is, I think, one of the major regional developments since the dialogue last converged in 2019, sort of the internal situation in Myanmar and what regional diplomacy can do to hopefully realize an end to the many internal conflicts and to hopefully reverse the outcomes of the coup there. But maritime security, the South China Sea, these issues, are always perennial topics at the Shangri-La dialogue. But again, their prominence this year, at least to me, seemed a little bit more limited, which I think speaks to the broader focus on U.S.-China competition and the implications of that for the region. I mean, that was really, I think, the overhang over this dialogue. And of course, the pandemic, I think, received an unsurprising level of attention in many of the speeches as well. Many of the, both Secretary Austin and Wei Fenghe emphasized their vaccine diplomacy of the U.S. and China respectively, and sort of what each country was doing to contribute to public goods in the area of public health.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I think we're going to leave it there today, unless you have anything else you want to add.
Well, the only other thing is, it was great to run into many listeners of the podcast at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is always a treat, and it was just good to be at the dialogue. And so, for all the listeners who sort of reached out at the dialogue in person, thank you. And if you of course have suggestions for me and Katie, you should just contact us. We're very happy to take that into consideration as we plan future episodes.
Yes. All right. And as always, I'll just say in Ankit's usual place, thanks for tuning in. If you liked what you heard on the show, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. If you haven't done this yet, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help new listeners find us. And finally, please reach out to Ankit or I with your suggestions for future episodes and any feedback to improve the podcast. I do want to just take a moment to personally thank the listeners who pointed out some audio issues that I was experiencing the last couple of episodes. Hopefully, we'll have resolved those this time around, but I really do appreciate feedback. So don't hesitate to reach out. We are listening, and thanks for listening to us, and we'll be back with more soon.